Picture Beijing in the year 1400, and most people picture the Forbidden City. Red walls, yellow-tiled roofs, a court of thousands of officials in silk robes. None of that existed yet. In 1400, the city was not even called Beijing. Its official name was Beiping, the pacified north, and it was not an imperial capital. It was the personal fief of a prince, the fourth son of the dynasty's founder, and it was located in the middle of a civil war. The Ming dynasty was only 32 years old. Its founder, the Hongwu emperor, had died in 1398, and the throne had passed to his teenage grandson in Nanjing, roughly 1,000 kilometers to the south. The prince who governed Beiping, Zhu Di, believed the throne should have been his. By the start of 1400, his soldiers were fighting the young emperor's armies across the plains of northern China, and only weeks earlier, his own son had commanded the defense of the city walls during a siege. A house in Beiping this year stood inside a city built on the remains of a foreign empire, governed by a man not yet known by the title history would eventually give him, the Yongle Emperor. The city itself had belonged to someone else only 3 decades earlier. Under the Mongol-led Yuan dynasty, it had been called Dadu, the great capital, and before that Khanbalik, the city of the Khan. When Ming forces captured it in 1368, the last Yuan emperor fled north across the steppe, and the Ming general who took the city, Shu Da, tore down the Mongol palace and moved the northern city wall nearly 3 kilometers inward, judging the original perimeter too large to hold with the troops available. The eastern, southern, and western walls still stood as the Mongols had built them, rammed earth faced with brick, rising well over 10 meters, pierced by 11 gates and surrounded by moats. Inside those walls, the streets still followed the grid the Mongols had laid out more than a century before, organized around narrow residential lanes that residents called hutong, a term most historians trace to a Mongolian word for water well. Nearly every one of these lanes had a well at its center, because the city had no other water supply. There were no pipes and no aqueducts, and every bucket that entered a house had been carried there by hand. Shops and stalls clustered along the wider through streets, some named for what was sold there, a grain market on one street, a livestock market on another, while behind these main avenues the hutong themselves stayed almost entirely residential and enclosed. The houses lining these lanes followed a design already standard across northern China, a rectangular compound enclosed on all 4 sides around a central courtyard. This layout, known as a siheyuan, followed a strict internal order. A single gate, set into the southeastern corner of the compound rather than facing the street directly, led inside. Just past the gate stood a low screen wall, positioned so that no one outside could see straight into the courtyard, and so that harmful influences believed to travel only in straight lines would be blocked from entering. The northernmost building, facing south to take in the winter sun, belonged to the head of the household and his wife. Buildings on the east and west sides of the courtyard housed married sons and their own families, with the east side considered the more favorable position. A smaller structure near the gate, receiving the least sunlight and the least warmth, housed servants and unmarried daughters. The size of the compound, the number of courtyards inside it, and even the style permitted for its gate, depended entirely on the rank of the family that owned it. Ming law was explicit on this point. Officials were forbidden from using certain curved roof gables, ornamental brackets, or painted ceilings unless their rank allowed it. Commoners were restricted to plain structures of no more than 3 bays, without carved brackets or painted decoration. A house was a visible record of exactly where a family stood, and building beyond what the law allowed for one's rank was a punishable offense. Interiors were furnished sparingly by later standards. A few wooden chairs and a table for a household with any means, chests for storing clothing and bedding, and paper rather than glass covering the wooden window lattices, which let in light while keeping out some of the wind. Glass remained rare and expensive, reserved for only the wealthiest homes. Inside that structure, authority belonged to the oldest living male, and every other member of the household was subordinate to him. Confucian teaching, which the new dynasty worked hard to restore after a century of Mongol rule, placed the relationship between father and son at the center of the social order, and filial duty was treated as a legal obligation rather than a private sentiment. A son who failed to mourn a parent properly or who spoke to an elder without respect, could be prosecuted under Ming law. Multiple generations shared a single compound by design. Grandparents, parents, unmarried children, and married sons with their own wives and children, all answering to the same household head. Marriages were arranged by parents on both sides, often years before the couple involved had any say in the matter, and were sealed through formal negotiations over a dowry and a bride price rather than through personal choice. Ancestors remained part of the household hierarchy after death. A wooden tablet inscribed with the name of each deceased parent or grandparent stood on an altar in the main hall, and living family members were expected to offer incense, food, and wine there on fixed days throughout the year. Neglecting these offerings was treated as seriously as neglecting a living parent. Daughters belonged to this household only temporarily. A girl was raised inside her father's compound and trained in domestic work until her marriage was arranged, at which point she left permanently to join her husband's family and take up the same duties inside a different set of walls. For women, and especially for women in households wealthy enough to afford it, daily life was organized around distance from the outside world. The inner courtyards, farthest from the street gate, were set aside for women and closed to male visitors outside the family. Small bound feet had become an increasingly common marker of status among Han Chinese families during this period, a practice that had spread under the Mongols and continued under the new dynasty, even though the Ming court did not require it of its own women. Binding began in early childhood and permanently changed how a woman walked for the rest of her life. A family that could keep its daughters and wives inside the home, unable to perform outdoor labor, was demonstrating that it did not depend on their work outside it, which was itself a form of wealth. Poorer families who needed every available hand for farming, spinning, or trade were far less likely to bind their daughters' feet, since bound feet made fieldwork and heavy carrying difficult. Regardless of wealth, spinning and weaving were considered central duties for women in nearly every household. The Hongwu emperor had actively promoted a division of labor summarized in a widely repeated phrase, "Men plow, women weave," and encouraged the planting of cotton and mulberry so that households could produce cloth to wear and cloth to pay as tax. Inside a Beiping house, this meant that spinning thread and sewing garments filled the hours after other chores were finished, work carried out by wives and daughters-in-law by lamplight after the evening meal. Households with sufficient wealth also kept bond servants, a category of dependent labor recognized under Ming law. Some had entered service after being sold by their own families during famine or debt. Others were descendants of people condemned under the criminal code, whose relatives had been confiscated as property and assigned to the households of officials the state wished to reward. Ming law described the bond between servant and household head, using the same language used to describe a father and his children, though the obligations ran in only one direction. A bond servant could be beaten for disobedience with far fewer consequences than applied to a free person, and could be bought, sold, or transferred, along with the rest of a family's property. In a modest household, none of this existed, and the work of hauling water and coal, cooking and cleaning fell to the family members themselves, generally assigned by age and sex, with young daughters-in-law taking on the heaviest and least pleasant chores. Hauling water was a daily task in every household regardless of wealth, since none of the wells scattered through the hutong were connected to individual homes. Water was drawn by bucket, carried across the courtyard, and stored in large jars near the kitchen, a task repeated multiple times a day and made considerably harder in winter, when bucket rims and jar surfaces iced over and the well rope itself could freeze stiff. Waste disposal followed an equally manual system. Most households used a simple pit or a covered container rather than any form of plumbing, and the contents were regularly collected, in many cities by workers who specialized in the task, and sold to farmers outside the walls as fertilizer for their fields. This exchange, unpleasant as it was for the households involved, tied the city directly to the farmland that fed it, in an agricultural economy that depended on returning nutrients to the soil rather than discarding them. Whatever a family's rank, winter in Beiping was the same season for everyone, and it was long and severe, with temperatures regularly falling well below freezing for months at a stretch. The single most important structure inside any northern Chinese house was not a fireplace but a raised brick platform called a kang, built along one wall of the main sleeping room and occupying close to half the room's floor space. A A kang was not furniture. It was built into the house itself. Underneath its brick or clay surface ran a series of channels connected directly to the cooking stove, so that the smoke and hot air produced by cooking a meal did not simply escape outside. Instead, it passed sideways through those channels, heating the thick masonry from below before finally venting through a chimney. That masonry held heat for hours after the cooking fire went out, meaning a single fire lit to prepare the evening meal could keep the platform warm well into the night. During the day, the same platform served as the place where the family sat to eat, sew, and receive visitors, with a low table set directly on its surface. At night, bedding was spread across it, and the household slept together on the warm brick, often several people sharing a single kang and its heat. Fuel for the stove came primarily from coal, mined in the hills west of the city and hauled in by cart and pack animal. Coal had already been the principal fuel in this region for well over a century, noted by foreign travelers, including Marco Polo during the Mongol period. A household's comfort through the winter could be measured directly in how much coal it could afford to burn, and how many rooms beyond the single heated platform it could keep from freezing entirely. Meals followed the same regional pattern as the heating. Rice, the staple of southern China, contributed only a small share of the diet this far north. The base of nearly every meal was wheat, ground into flour and formed into noodles, steamed buns, or flatbread. Noodles were shaped by hand, either pulled and stretched into long strands, or cut with a wide blade from sheets of rolled dough, methods already well established across the north by this period. This wheat base was supplemented by millet and sorghum porridge, soybeans, and whatever vegetables could be stored through the cold months, mainly cabbage, turnips, and pickled greens packed into earthenware jars before the first frost. None of the foods now closely associated with Chinese cooking, including corn, sweet potatoes, peanuts, chili peppers, and tomatoes, existed anywhere in China yet. Those crops would not arrive from the Americas for another century. Meat appeared only occasionally in most households rather than daily, and mutton was more common in the north than pork, a lingering effect of a century under Mongol rule during which sheep had been central to the regional economy. The same stove that heated the kang also cooked the family's food, typically a large iron pot set into a brick hearth and fed by the same fire that warmed the platform behind it, so that cooking and heating were a single combined task rather than two separate ones. Many kitchens kept a small tablet or paper image near the stove dedicated to the kitchen god, a household deity believed to observe the family's conduct all year and report on it to higher powers around the new year, and offerings of food or sweet paste were placed before this tablet to keep his report favorable. Meals themselves were eaten in an order that matched the household's structure. The oldest generation was served first, then adult sons, then everyone else, a sequence every member of the household understood without needing to be told. Clothing followed the same rules of rank as the house itself. In 1396, only 4 years before this period, the Hongwu emperor had tightened an already detailed set of regulations governing exactly what each class of person was permitted to wear. Officials were assigned specific colors and patterns according to rank. Ordinary commoners were restricted to plain garments in dull colors, made from hemp or the increasingly available cotton, which had spread north from its original base in southern China over the preceding century after Mongol-era policies encouraged its cultivation. Silk, satin, and brocade were reserved by law for the wealthy and titled, and merchants, regardless of how much money they had accumulated, were specifically forbidden from wearing silk at all, since Confucian officials regarded merchants as socially beneath farmers, no matter their wealth. Winter clothing depended entirely on what a family could afford as insulation. Wealthier households padded their winter robes with silk floss and lined them with fur. Everyone else used cotton batting sewn between 2 layers of cloth, a technique that had only become widely affordable within the past few generations, and that, before cotton, had depended on scarcer materials such as processed paper fiber or hemp waste. A family's entire wardrobe, its permitted colors, its fabric, even the cut of its collar, could be read from a distance as a precise statement of exactly where that family stood. The timing of each day was set not by the household but by the city itself. At its center stood a bell tower and a drum tower, built by the Mongols more than a century earlier as the official timekeeping center of the capital, and they continued to serve that function under the new dynasty. Officials struck the bell to mark daytime hours and beat the drum to mark the passage of the night, which was divided into 5 two-hour watches, each announced by a fixed pattern of drum beats audible across the rooftops of the entire city. When the drum sounded the final watch before dawn, the city gates and the gates sealing off individual hutong opened, and the working day began. When night fell, those same gates closed, and moving through the streets without a specific reason and the right to be there was a punishable offense. Inside the house, this same structure of fixed hours governed daily labor. Water and coal had to be carried before the morning meal. Cooking fires had to be lit and banked on a schedule tied to meal times. Even sleep was not fully private, with an entire family sharing 1 or 2 heated rooms through the coldest months. Rest followed the collective schedule of the household, rather than the preference of any single person inside it. For a household with any ambition, a son's education offered the clearest path toward improving the family's standing, since the Ming had reopened the civil service examinations that Mongol rule had allowed to lapse for much of the previous century. A boy from a family with any resources began studying the Confucian classics as young as 5 or 6, memorizing texts he would not fully understand for years, under the instruction of his father, an uncle, or a hired tutor if the family could afford one. Passing the lowest level of the examination system could exempt a family from certain forms of labor service owed to the state. Passing the highest levels could place a son inside the government itself and transform his family's entire social standing within a single generation. This possibility, however distant for most households, shaped daily life inside the home directly. A study space, however small, was treated as the most important room a modest house could set aside, and a son excused from physical chores in order to study was not considered idle. He was considered to be performing the most valuable labor the household could invest in. Daughters received a different education, centered on textile work, household management, and moral instruction drawn from texts written specifically for women, preparing them for a household they would eventually leave to join. All of this domestic order existed inside a city that was, in 1400, actively at war. Zhu Di had governed Beiping since 1380, guarding the northern frontier against the remnants of the Mongol Empire his family had displaced. When his nephew, the new emperor in Nanjing, began stripping other imperial princes of their titles and armies in 1399, Zhu Di rebelled rather than wait to share their fate, and by the beginning of 1400 his forces and the emperor's forces were fighting across the plains of Hebei and Shandong provinces. Beiping itself had come under direct siege only weeks earlier, when an imperial army under the general Li Jinglong, reported to number in the hundreds of thousands, surrounded the city while Zhu Di was away campaigning, leaving his eldest son, Zhu Gaoqi, in command of its defense with a garrison of roughly 10,000 men. Zhu Gaoqi held the walls through the early winter, and when temperatures dropped far enough, he ordered water poured over the fortifications overnight, coating them in ice too slick for the attacking soldiers to climb. The siege broke, and the imperial army withdrew. For households inside the walls, this was not a distant event. It meant men conscripted into the prince's army, families uncertain whether sons or husbands stationed on the frontier were still alive, and grain, coal, and cloth requisitioned for the war effort, even during the coldest months of the year. The same walls that had just held off that siege, built by the Mongols and shortened decades earlier by the first Ming general to hold the city, would not be rebuilt into the fortifications later associated with the Ming capital for another 2 decades. In 1400, they were simply the walls that had held. The city most people picture when they hear the name Beijing today, with its palace of red walls and yellow-tiled roofs, its wide processional avenues, and its population in the hundreds of thousands, did not yet exist. Zhu Di would not become emperor until 1402, would not begin construction of a new palace until 1406, and would not officially move the imperial court north from Nanjing until 1421. Everything described here, the courtyard houses, the heated sleeping platforms, the wells at the center of every lane, the bell and drum towers marking the hours, the strict hierarchies inside and outside the home, belonged to an earlier and smaller city, a princely capital on a war footing, built on the walls and streets of an empire the Ming had only recently displaced. Much of that underlying layout, the hutong lanes, the orientation of the courtyard houses, the daily schedule organized around bells and gates, survived largely intact for the next 500 years, carried forward into the capital Zhu Di eventually built and his successors expanded, long after the war that defined the winter of 1400 had been resolved and left to the historians who went looking for it. Most of the families living inside those walls that winter, carrying water from the Hutong well and banking the fire under the Kang before sleep, had no way of knowing that their city was only 2 decades away from becoming the seat of one of the largest empires on earth. To them it was simply home, in a hard season, in a city still uncertain of its own future.